This is lecture 73C on Turkey, Capitalism meets Bolshevism. It's also the last lecture in our series that accompanies Volume 5. That'll probably be available in about a month. And so the 2018 edition is going to have 5 volumes, not just 4. At any rate, we're going to begin with the history of the manufacturing and guilds during the AD 1200s. Then the organization of shop manufacturing in Anatolia was done by the Ahi, that is AHI, Brotherhood. It was a craft union and a Sufi Islamic religious organization. Members were merchants and craftsmen who took pride in their work and in their adherence to Islam. By AD 1580, guilds were well established in Ottoman society. The guilds were organizations that were responsible for the maintenance of professional standards. Belonging to an esnaf, ESNAF, or guild, gave craftspeople a voice and were often the source of a family surname in Arabic, such as Smith is among English Christians. A range of social, political, and economic ties linked handicraft producers to one another. Guilds were of both sexes organized independently. Members often shared tools, worked together as well as alone, and their guilds were varied among societies, social class, and genders. There were hierarchies within the guilds, and a collective identity was established in the process of interaction and manipulated according to circumstance. In the AD 1300s and 1400s, the Islamic governments of Turkey often allowed guilds to include rival monotheists such as Christians and Jews. At any rate, by AD 1651, the uprisings of Istanbul were a successful protest against the government. People marched on the palace and got a powerful religious leader on their side in order to get the vizier, V-I-Z-I-E-R, to step down. They made their voices heard as a group within their guild and gave people a sense of pride to belong to a guild. Guild politicians controlled economic activity within the guilds. Now, contrary to general assumption, even in the highly segmented world of the early modern period, trading diasporas did not simply act as middlemen within dominant societies, but also developed durable commercial ties with other merchant groups outside institutional structures. Not all workers were equal among guilds. Many of them had hierarchies which varied among different regions. Being a part of a guild was a big part of one's identity. Guilds declined as political authorities found their prosperity and commercial success a challenge to their domination of urban politics. Guilds were a major part of the Ottoman Empire. In that empire, many young women were hired to unwind cocoon, spin silk, threads, and weave. The effect was empowering for them and threatening to the male-dominated kulak-run village structure. As time proceeded, women found that they could organize outside of guilds, and the cloth makers were among the first to do so. Women would exchange goods among each other within female markets, and in the late AD 1500s there were estates of peasant women living near Konya and owning some jewelry with market activity. Now, Ottoman guilds were a major part of an economy that was otherwise very government-dominated, especially in the cities. Along Turkey's seaboards and borderlands were opportunities for commerce. Consequently, contact and immigration occurred, melding non-Islamic believers, such as Jews, into Ottoman society. Accordingly, there were many different religions within guilds. Ottoman politics backed up commerce when merchants negotiated contracts called capitulations. The Ottoman-Venetian conflicts led to win-win international commerce booms in Dubrovnik, Florence, Ancona, and Genoa. In the AD 1400s and early 1500s, Florence, Genoa, and Venice vied for control of Ottoman markets and merchandise, primarily in the north and east. Muslim traders dominated several Ottoman exchanges and some international routes. There were links between cities and the countryside, and although direct commercial exchanges were probably the exception rather than the rule, the empire was separated into zones, and merchants were limited to buying only from the source they had been assigned. In small towns, craft structure was simple with one or a few types. Among tailors were those who made fabrics into ready-to-wear clothing. In large cities, producers were highly specialized, so there were different guilds. Entrepreneurs and their collective guild workshops meant these new factories were a means of social control by their owners and guild compradors. Every member was monitored very closely. This meant the secret police had a definite way in. Partnerships existed among petty bourgeois owners and their guild compradors. In the early modern period, bleachers, twisters, and dyers, craftsmen, not only owned their own equipment, but their own shops as well. A compound product, such as silk, might pass through the hands of many different craftsmen before reaching the consumer. Now, in the period 1780 to 1900, while looking at Ottoman manufacture, Donald Cattart, a professor, points out that one must not only look at large factories, but also the small workshops. When doing so, he says, one will find then that Ottoman industry was not a dying, unadaptive, unevolving sector, but it was vital, creative, evolving, and diverse. And that's from an article he wrote in the year 2000 called The Ottoman Empire, 1700 to 1922, New Approaches to European History. Now, in the 1800s, a shift occurred to rural female labor, with guild-organized, urban-based male labor less important. Some global markets for Ottoman goods declined as capitalists found new cheap labor sources, but on the other hand, certain Ottoman capitalist sectors expanded. So, overall, international market declines were compensated by the increase in domestic consumption and demand. There were 26 million domestic consumers, so Turkey could avoid outright colonization by European caps. Mechanized production remains an insignificant portion of the total output in that period, and the lack of capital, as in other areas of the economy, deterred the mechanization of production. Nonetheless, a number of factories did emerge in Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire, and Anatolia, because nothing could negate the iron law of capitalism. In the 1830s, steam-powered silk reeling factories emerged in Salonika, Edirne, West Anatolia, and the Lebanon. Under the late 1700s, fine textiles, handmade yarns, and leathers were in higher demand outside the empire. However, these declined by the early 1800s, and half-century later production for export reemerged in the form of raw silk and oriental carpets. In 1914, two industries alone employed 100,000 persons, with two-thirds of them in carpet making for European and American buyers. Most workers were women and girls, receiving wages that were amongst the lowest in the manufacturing sector. Much of the manufacturing shifted to the urban areas during the 1700s. As imperialist competition forced down prices and guilds were powerless to stop that, the declines were important. In 1826, when their backers, the elite guards called Janissaries, were disbanded by Mahmud II, the guild's fate was sealed. So to recap, manufacturing from 1600 to 1914 witnessed remarkable continuities in the loci of manufacturing. Industrial profit centers flourishing in the 1600s were still active in 1914 on the eve of the imperialist World War. Domestic manufacturing had struggled against Asian and European competition in the 1700s and 1800s as the products of handicraft industry were replaced by cheaper capitalist mechanized industry produced imports. However, manufacturing achieved surprising output levels, with the decline of some industries being more than compensated by the rise of new industries. Decline of handicraft production saw a shift of output move to agricultural commodity production and other manufacturing output. In the 1800s, then, in the early 19th century, Ottoman Egypt had an advanced economy with a per capita income comparable to that of leading Western European countries such as France, and higher than the overall income of Europe and Japan. Economic historians estimate that Egypt in 1800 had a per capita income of $1,025 $1990. In addition to Egypt, Syria and southeast Anatolia had a highly productive manufacturing sector that had evolved in the 1800s. Now, industrialization. In 1819, Egypt, under Muhammad Ali, began programs of state-sponsored industrialization, which included setting up factories for weapons production, an iron foundry, large-scale cotton cultivation, mills for ginning, spinning, and weaving of cotton, and enterprises for agricultural processing. By the early 1830s, Egypt had 30 cotton mills, employing about 30,000 workers. In the early 19th century, Egypt had the world's fifth most productive cotton industry in terms of the number of spindles per capita. The industry was initially driven by machinery that relied on traditional energy sources, such as animal power, water wheels, and windmills, which were principal energy sources in Western Europe until 1870. In AD 1551, the engineer Taq ad-Din Muhammad ibn Maruf in Ottoman Egypt had experimented with steam power. He invented a steam jack driven by a rudimentary steam turbine. In 1810, under Muhammad Ali of Egypt, steam engines were introduced to Egyptian industrial manufacturing. To fuel the steam engines, the Egyptians had to have a cheap, close supply of coal, so prospectors searched for coal deposits, and in the meantime imported coal. Local capitalists manufactured boilers by building ironworks, and with these boilers they could supply the secondary industries of textile manufacturing, paper mills, and hulling mills. In 1830, Egypt's Ottoman caps gained access to coal in Lebanon that then produced 4,000 tons a year. Otherwise, the necessary economic conditions for rapid industrialization existed in Egypt. In 1849, Muhammad Ali died, and so did much of his industrialization plans. At that time, Egypt was well on its way to being the main supplier of cotton to world capitalists. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire had a liberal trade policy open to foreign imports. This has its origins in capitulation contracts of the Ottoman Empire with France in the Commercial Treaty of 1536. Capitulation contracts in 1673 and 1740 lowered duties to 3% for imports and exports. However, UK Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli considered the Ottoman commercial treaties to be, quote, an instance of the injury done by unrestrained competition, unquote. In the 1846 Corn Laws debate, he went on to say, there had been free trade in Turkey, and what has it produced? It has destroyed some of the finest manufacturers of the world. As late as 1812, these manufacturers existed, but they have been destroyed. That was the consequence of competition in Turkey, and its effects have been as pernicious as the effects of the contrary principle in Spain. In 1900, oil began to replace coal as the energy source for its steam engines in the capitalist world. Along the way, it was capitalism as a stage in socio-cultural evolution that determined the political journey of the Turkish Republic. The turning point in this journey were all byproducts of the development of capitalism. The turning points reflect the class dynamics of capitalism as they correspond to the needs of and mirror the power of the bourgeoisie, the dominant class. That was the case with the transition to multi-party democracy in 1946, the military coups in 1971 and 1980, and the ascent of the AKP to power in 2002. In the beginning, the Cultural Revolution of Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, died with him. Since then, the Turkish government has been not so much an agent of secularist revolution as of capitalist development. Indeed, Atatürk's biggest achievement was to lay the foundations of the latter. After the non-Muslim bourgeoisie of the Ottoman Empire had been eliminated, the new republic set about to nurture a new Turkish and Muslim bourgeoisie. Turkey's transition to a multi-party system in 1946 reflected the growing cloud of the bourgeoisie. Since 1950, the parties of the bourgeoisie have been in power most of the time, with the bourgeoisie in the lead role the state bureaucracy has performed the supporting role, facilitating capitalist development. When the military has intervened, it has done so not to save secularism, as the conventional narrative holds, but to save capitalism and to protect the dominant class. Capitalist development and the working class movement. The process of the capitalist development of Turkey is a rather belated process with respect to the West. This historical delay flows from the peculiar socio-economic structure upon which Turkish capitalism developed. For this reason, in order to understand the peculiarities of Turkish capitalism, it is necessary to have an overview of the economic and social history of the Ottoman Empire that forms the historical background of modern Turkey today. In AD 1300, the Ottoman Empire kicked off. In AD 1453, the conquest of Istanbul got on its way to ruling Anatolia, the Southeast Balkans, and much of Arabia. For the next 6 centuries, it was the major player in that part of the world. The first period, which lasted until the 1600s, was a period of rise into a colossal empire, with conquests in Asia and Europe. Its mode of production featured slavery and feudalism as the unfree condition of the mass of producers. The second period lasted from the 1600s to 1800s and found its slavocrat and serfocrat rulers in an off-again, on-again relationship with capitalist Europe. Struggles for power among the ruling classes intensified. The third period takes in all of the 1800s until its collapse after World War I. Now, as we have seen, the Asiatic mode of production, as Karl Marx termed it, is nothing more than the form taken when ruling classes respond to mass uprisings with on-again, off-again reforms. In other words, vacillating slave and feudal modes of production, and in this regard, Turkey was typical. The Ottoman ruling classes used their state apparatus, or police and army, to reinforce whichever historically momentary mode of production upon which they had agreed. Along the way, the Ottoman state apparatus conquered many lands that gave the rulers the booty to pay their cops and thug soldiers. In this way, it was possible to use the grateful men of the state apparatus to police the Muslim and non-Muslim populations' direct producers into being the de facto taxpayers bonded to the land they worked that others owned. A military bureaucracy called the Sipahi, S-I-P-A-H-I, administered these lands. As always happens when generals or sergeants realize they can replace their employers, so it did in Turkey. The generals and NCOs who bossed the Sipahi became an important constituent of the ruling class, as they simply deposed their previous bosses. Now what was collected as surplus went into their pockets, and not the pockets of the previous owners. This meant the imperial profit centers were ultimately based on war and land conquest. This was the production relationship that enabled all the ruling classes of the Ottoman Empire to support the army, which in turn kept them in the condition to which they had become accustomed. When factories replaced army and police units as the principal profit centers in Ottoman society, it collapsed. The old social composition of Ottoman society had a state apparatus ruling class at the top, and the direct farmer and craftsman at the bottom. With the coming of factories and banks, agrarian communes and the craftsman guilds in towns took on new roles. Of course, as in all servitude epic societies of the slave and feudal type, there was an essential bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie that conducted trade as an important additional profit center. And as in the East Asia and South Asia, the hatred of the landed nobility, military and non-military, for these merchant classes was never-ending. Commodities produced by sharp trading, or even worse, in factories, meant this private trade and free exchange put political power in these additional owners of economic power. Some of the Sipahi were smart enough to join them when they could not beat them. However, for most of that bunch, the accumulation of merchant capital and the concomitant formation of a merchant class within the system was simply viewed as too dangerous. Nevertheless, there was a structural contradiction in the Ottoman mode of production, because long-distance trade in Ottoman society was necessary. It was necessary to satisfy the needs of the Sultan, Sipahi bosses, and the high-level military-civil bureaucracy that lived in the towns. There was, of course, the underlying contradiction of all servitude epic society, and that was that poverty of producers at the bottom. Not sharing in the wealth were all those who worked for a living. At the same time, capitalism in Europe and the Americas was extinguishing slavery and feudalism in their parts of the world. For Turkey, the 20th century meant the time was at hand to make a historic decision. Namely, the Turk Caps had decided to take power themselves directly or face colonization by the European Caps. The process of dissolution of the Ottoman Empire had entered its last phase. The Ottoman Bank had been established by French capitalism and now began to function as a central bank, taking over the management of the Ottoman currency. Likewise, after this severe debt crisis, the Ottoman treasury was handed over to an international council called the General Debts, which was comprised of the representatives of the imperialist countries. Confronting the hostility of their class brothers in Europe were two Ottoman ruling class parties. One of them contended that their goal was independence while ruling, and that could be achieved by maintaining the old despotic traditions. The other party stood for joining the structural change embraced by Europe that they called Westernization and Modernization. Having materialized as the Young Turk movement, this reformist wing established its independent political organization under the name of the Committee for Union and Progress. This wing managed to take power in 1908 and proclaimed a constitutional monarchy. Almost all the cadres who would later lead the establishment of the bourgeois republic came out of this Committee for Union and Progress movement and organization. Taking aside, the nationalist leadership of the Committee for Union and Progress reckoned that the remedy for salvation was to approach the rising German imperialism and to side with it in the World War. The rising German imperialism had established, at the expense of its imperialist rivals, a great influence over the Ottoman Empire and condemned it to financial slavery at the turn of the century. The Ottoman regime entered the World War with its weak economy and feeble armed forces and was defeated and ruined. After the war, the imperialist forces occupied all the lands of the empire except a small region in central Anatolia. This led to the sharpening of contradictions within the Ottoman ruling class, and hence the decisive breakaway of the wing that would lead to the establishment of the bourgeois republic later. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk came to prominence for his role in securing the Ottoman-Turkish victory at the Battle of Gallipoli during World War I. Following the empire's defeat and subsequent dissolution, he led the Turkish national movement that opposed Turkey's partition among the victorious Allied powers. Establishing a provisional government in present-day Turkish capital of Ankara, he defeated the forces sent by the Allies, thus emerging victorious from what is referred to as the Turkish War of Independence. He subsequently proceeded to abolish the decrepit Ottoman Empire and proclaimed the foundation of the Turkish Republic in its place. Which brings us to Bolshevism arriving at its first Congress. On the 10th of September 1920, the Communist Party of Turkey, or TKP, was founded at a Congress in Baku. It was composed of three different left-wing Turkish groups who accepted Lenin's view of the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia. These were 1. The Istanbul-based Workers' and Peasants' Socialist Party of Turkey, 2. Leninists in the Green Army of Anatolia, and 3. A group of Turkish communists in Soviet Russia who were former Turkish prisoners of war who had been recruited by the Bolsheviks. In total, this first Congress was made up of 74 delegates, and that Congress elected Mustafa Sufi as the party chairman and Etham Nejat as the general secretary. After its foundation, the party became a section of the Communist International. The founding of the TKP occurred in the midst of the independence war in Turkey that followed the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, which we just mentioned. In order to counter the growing influence of Turkish communists, Ataturk set up a parallel puppet communist party called the People's Communist Party of Turkey, CHP. Although a separate party, the TKP cadres were present in the leadership of the People's Communist Party as the Cheka struggled to get control of this schismatic threat. The founders of TKP, Mustafa Sufi and his 14 other comrades, were then murdered. Now, at the Second Congress, in December 1921, the People's Communist Party was legalized. Now, this provided an opportunity for the TKP to work in a more open manner. The People's Communist Party held its Congress in August, which the TKP considered as its second Congress. The Congress elected Salih Hasioglu as the party's general secretary. The People's Communist Party was banned next month, and around 200 party cadres were arrested. That took us to the Third Congress. In January 1925, the Third Party Congress was held in Istanbul. The Congress elected Sefik Husnu as the new General Secretary. Husnu's group in Istanbul had conducted semi-legal activities and published Aydınlık on instructions from the Comintern. The party started to publish Ork Sakik, which in contrast to Aydınlık was directed towards the working class. The sole delegate from the left of the party was Salih Hasioglu. The TKP suffered 3 waves of crackdowns on its cadres in 1925, 1927, and 1929. In addition to the external pressure, the party also suffered from internal divisions, and the role of the party towards the Comintern and the governing CHP party were in dispute. Albeit an illegal party, the TKP issued a series of publications, and then I named them. There were 4 of them. And the party organized a conference in Vienna in 1926. There was the Fourth Congress. In 1932, the Fourth TKP Congress was held, and Husnu was re-elected as the party's general secretary. In the 1960s, the Workers' Party of Turkey, TIP, emerged as a strong force. The foundation of TIP occurred in the relatively more open political atmosphere of that moment. TIP became a leading force within the trade union movement, leading the Confederation of Revolutionary Labor Unions, or DISK, D-I-S-K, which was founded in 1967. In addition to that, TIP became the first Turkish political party that put the Kurdish question into its agenda. However, as the political situation became yet more intense and the more radical wings of the left movement opted for armed struggle, TIP was banned. The banning of TIP would strengthen the TKP, as many TIP cadres now joined the underground TKP instead. It led semi-legal mass organizations and became the leading force within DISK. The Atlium, or LEAP. At the beginning of the 1970s, labor organizations and left-wing political parties faced the despotism of the 1971 Turkish coup d'etat. Despite the pressure of the military junta, this progressive movement rose and challenged the political situation in Turkey. The riots of the university students in 1968 and the big strike of workers on the 15th and 16th of June 1970 became major sources of inspiration for this progress under the leadership of General Secretary Ismail Bailen. The TKP saw this trend as a new era of revolution and reform, so named it Atlium, which means leap in Turkish. Despite the party's illegality and the problems of working underground, TKP found a way to intervene in the political agenda of the country with the support of DISK. This era of progress for TKP and the other left-wing organizations in Turkey was ended by the 1980 Turkish coup d'etat. And that brings us to the formation of the United Communist Party of Turkey in 1988, when the TKP merged with the TP and formed the United Party of Turkey. United Communist Party of Turkey, or TBKP. Due to the ban on communist political activities in Turkey, the TBKP was formed in a clandestine Congress, but its stated aim was to operate legally. In 1990, its leaders officially established the TBKP as a formal political party, which would be banned the next year. Nevertheless, before it was banned, the TBKP had already held a legal Congress in January 1991. In this Congress, a resolution was overwhelmingly adopted calling on all its members to join a project to form a broader-based socialist party, the Socialist Unity Party, and that would evolve into the Freedom and Solidarity Party. Currently, there are several factions in Turkey that claim to represent the historical TKP. One is the TKP that separated in 1979 from the main TKP that published the periodical Workers' Voice. Second, a new TKP, which adopted the name in 2001 of the Party for Socialist Power, or SIP, that has no organizational link with the historical TKP, but this movement was dissolved in 2014. And third, a grouping of some dissident members of the TBKP who held a rebirth meeting in 1993 and started to publish the periodical Harvest Socialist magazine. After the rebirth meeting in 1993, the contributors of the meeting restarted the publications in 1997. In 2012, they officially announced the reestablishment of the TKP. However, this initiative resulted as a dichotomy because of the existence of another party, former SIP, which started to use the same name in 2001. Therefore, the contributors of the Rebirth Initiative decided to change the official name of the TKP as TKP 1920. And that brings us up to the present day condition of the struggle for communism in Turkey. That's the last lecture in the series of lectures that accompany Volume 5. That, as I think I said earlier, should be available in another month or so.